Well, welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you came to join us here for this talk today by Professor Jodok Troy. It's a timely talk. Let me first say, my name is Patterson. I'm a research fellow here at the Berkley Center. I was here for 4 years full-time as an associate director and faculty member from from 2008 to 2012. And it's just a joy to retain the friendship and the relationship with the center. This center was founded out of the office of the university president in 2006 with a specific focus on religious factors in international affairs, religion and development, religion and foreign policy, international religion, international religious freedom, and religious freedom policy. So understanding religious actors, religious organizations, religious beliefs, themes writ large across international life. And today's topic is particularly valuable because we have a talk today that looks at power, in a sense, in other words, authority from non-state actors. During the Cold War, Stalin famously said, "How many divisions does the Pope have?" Right? And his ideology and his form of government in some ways is in the dustbin of history. And just an hour ago, the two principal actors in our talk today were on the same stage at the United Nations as Pope Francis was giving a speech to the UN General Assembly. So this topic is very timely. Our speaker today comes to us almost a decade ago in the Berkley Center's first full year in this building in 2007. He was doing doctoral research here at Georgetown University. And then he went to be a faculty member at the University of Innsbruck. Since then, he's published as an author or editor 6 books on religion and international affairs. And he's currently the principal investigator on a 3-year research project on faith and international life. And perhaps he'll tell us just a little bit about that. He remains based in Innsbruck, Austria. So we're delighted he came all the way back, in a sense, to Georgetown University. He's going to come and deliver some remarks for 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll take some question and answer. And during that time, I'll give some instructions. But I hope that you'll be ready when we get there to engage in a lively discussion. So without further ado, would you please help me in welcoming Dr. Jodok Troy.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Eric, and thank you, first of all, to the Berkley Center and to Eric for hosting and for having me over here, as he said, almost a decade after my first stay at Georgetown University, which was a very good half year of my life I spent here at Georgetown University. Now, first of all, I have to say it's a sheer coincidence that my talk today collides with Pope Francis being in the United States and this very morning addressing the United Nations and talking with his counterpart, Ban Ki-moon, but more about that in a minute. Basically, my talk lines out the main points, a larger project I'm pursuing right now, essentially comparing the Pope and UN Secretary General as individuals, but also regarding their staff and approaches to diplomacy, for example. So in other words, it's about, at the end of the day, seeing the Pope or having a perspective on the Pope with instruments of political science and having a perspective on the UN Secretary General with a political theology. In other words, what the bottom line of my talk and my basic idea of comparing those two figures of international authority, as Eric said, is that what we call the religious and what we call the assumedly secular sphere are in fact not that different as we see them or as we want them to be. And this is particularly evident in the quote Eric said about, or which is referring to Joseph Stalin, who once said that how many divisions does the Pope actually have? And this anecdote is recorded in Winston Churchill's memoirs, and Winston Churchill recalls this anecdote. Stalin asking the French foreign minister, well, what do you tell me about Catholics? I ask you, how many divisions does the Pope really have? And that's a quite familiar quote all over political science departments doing stuff with religion and IR. However, what is not that well known is the own annex from Churchill, which he gave to this anecdote. And he said, well, that might all be true. However, he might certainly have mentioned all those legends not always visible on parade, meaning all those faithful Catholics all over the world. And that's exactly where my talk is going to start. You are my lay counterpart, the so-called secular Pope. The Pope Paul VI once told UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld in the 1960s. And indeed, the Pope and UN Secretary General represent as many people in normative claims as any other leaders could do. Both individuals and their institutions in their back are seen as moral authorities and are widely, although not everywhere, acknowledged. There are several striking features, I argue, when looking at the roles and characteristics of the Pope and UN Secretary General, mainly in terms of agency, meaning having certain power to act as an individual. First, as I said, there's a wide public awareness of both. This is because both represent and speak on behalf of so many, one more on behalf of individuals, the other one more on behalf of states. And second, both actually can do little due to their lack of material power. Nevertheless, both exercise and influence power among and beyond their followers and opponents alike. For example, mostly in terms of what Joseph and I would call soft power. So in a general sense, in public awareness, both positions are viewed to be quite different. Against this prevailing perspective, I argue that they are in fact quite similar. Comparing them in terms of scope and aim of their agency, the normative claims which they put forward, I illustrate that I try to illustrate that their agency appeals to and influences the structure of their institutions and their dialogue with their objectives. Both institutions, the Catholic Church, the Vatican, and the United Nations, or to be more precise, the Secretariat of the United Nations, are kind of representative of the growing pluralization on the global scale, religious and secular, modern and anti-modern, conservative and liberal, progressive, and so on and so forth. Neither of the two commands any traditional hard, that is to say material, power. However, as I would say, that is not the point. The point is that it is not the lack of an army to command, but the lack of a party to lead and a body politic to rally behind, which both of them actually have. So I therefore ask, why is it that popes and secretary generals display political affects beyond the original constitution of their institutions, and what does that tell us about the nature of their power and their influence? I approach this question with the assumption that it is actually a mix of individuals in institutions leading to the evolution of the papacy and UN Secretary General Secretariat since 1945. Both develop and possess influence apart from their constitutional foundations, the Charter, for example, or the doctrines in the case of the Church, and structural constraints in terms of bureaucracy, for example. Moreover, if the position of the Pope and UN Secretary General are in fact that similar, then I would say a parallel look at those two individuals helps us to understand their independent agency. First of all, both exercise their post out, as I said, of a mix of weak material capability and strong normative power. Second, in recognizing the similarity between the two, the nature of their institutions and their office holders are, as I said in the introduction, from my point of view, evidence of the actual mix of secular and religious political representation and normative claims in the world or in world politics. So in this way, the Pope and the UN Secretary General are similar, since both depend on the character of their office holder, but also of the character of their institution. It is therefore not only authority and autonomy of the organization, the authority of the United Nations invoked by the preamble of the Charter and so on and so forth, arising out of delegated moral and expert authority. Executive heads, as I see the Pope and the Secretary General, are more importantly in authority and an authority themselves. So why should we care about the Pope and the Secretary General? After all, despite theoretical insights on IR theory and leadership studies, it is foremost policy and normative implications that are appealing and which have been long neglected. And that is to say, because an ever-growing enlargement of human expectations, as the former Secretary General Javier Cuellar once called it, is what makes papal and Secretary General leadership disputed, but nevertheless appealing forces in world politics. And this is especially to say that due to the unsettled nature of contemporary international affairs, the power of more or less unbiased moral suasion by legitimate international authority figures, such as Pope Francis, not so much, and as Ban Ki-moon, may be increasing. With the approaching end of the current term of Ban Ki-moon, the project results might or should actually be able to show what personal and structural changes he likely leaves behind and which might influence in turn his successor. On one side. On the other side, while there's no way to see the end of the term of Pope Francis, Pope Francis seems to be an indicator proving my main assumption or thesis of this project correct, that an exceptional personality that is influenced by a rather unique structure shapes his office just because of this conjunction of this individual and the institution. This is, for example, the case with Francis' approach of giving up, more or less giving up the talk on human rights, on individual human rights, and instead referring more on social justice, structural problems, and collective solutions that individual rights may not be able to solve at all. What international relations generally miss is that while their leaders, institutions such as the Catholic Church and the United Nations can have unexpected and admittedly unintended effects on international politics beyond the formal mission statement, beyond those actually 3 paragraphs written down in the Charter of the United Nations, what the Secretary General should or could do or can do. The actual practice is, I argue, an overlooked element that grounds itself not only on a formal constitutional practice, those 3 paragraphs, or the Code of Canon Law, but it's more than that. And this more than that is best captured perhaps in Dag Hammarskjöld's following remarks when he said that the principles of the Charter are by far greater than the organization in which they are embodied, and the aims which they are to safeguard are holier than the policies of any single nation or people, end of quote. So studies on leadership make no clear distinction at the end of the day between the executive head of organizations or the constitution of the organization as such. This likely results in the fact that few theoretical or policy claims about executive heads can or are made. Executive heads must propose to be successful, a strategic plan containing a certain vision they want to implement. Both executive heads, the Pope and the Secretary General, laid out, all of them laid out strategic plans and visions, yet their implementing strategies differed widely. For example, Dag Hammarskjöld's vision of an independent secretariat or an independent civil service of the United Nations, or Boutros Boutros-Ghali's agenda for peace, or Pope John Paul XXIII's initiation of the Second Vatican Council, or his remarks concerning the threatening of the nuclear age, or Pope John Paul II's approaches towards interreligious dialogues. All of them, nevertheless, try to seize windows of opportunities. Some choose follower-oriented strategies, meaning to convince followers, already followers. For example, Boutros Boutros-Ghali was much more keen to convince his followers and the follower states that his agenda for peace is actually a good thing. While, on the other hand, others choose opposition-oriented strategies, meaning to mobilize the opposition towards a certain vision of peace or whatever. For example, Hammarskjöld and John XXIII's approaches. Some accompanied their implementation strategies with institutional and administrative change. For example, Dag Hammarskjöld really did restructure the basic settings of the United Nations, or John XXIII really did try to implement some changes in the structure of the Curia and so on and so forth. Some did not at all. Again, Boutros Boutros-Ghali. Given all this talk about leadership and executive heads, a leader is commonly defined as someone who helps a group actually to create and achieve shared goals. So what leaders therefore do is as important as what they are and what material resources they command. So whereas power does not equal leadership, the opposite is also true. Leadership does not equal power in a materialist sense. It is also charisma that drives authority. Popes such as John Paul II and Secretary General such as Hammarskjöld fall, or Kofi Annan fall under this category. So they all of them pursued actions while in office that did not only change the institution due to their former delegated expert and moral authority, but just as importantly, their charisma became the impetus for institutional changes and policy outreaches. So transforming the structure around it to infer roles, as it is true for Hammarskjöld, for example, concerning an independent secretariat, and John XXIII on his initiation of the Second Vatican Council. However, at the same time, we have to admit that, for example, all those approaches, which are nowadays called silent diplomacy, working behind the scenes and so on and so forth, were not carried on to this extent by the successors of Hammarskjöld and other Secretary Generals, let alone that they became a part of the structure of the United Nations. Similarly, the so-called shuttle diplomacy of John Paul II was not in any way institutionalized by his successors. Pope John Paul II may have been a globe-trotter, but he was certainly not a global pope, a true global pope. The current one, I would say, is one. So it is not about individuals or institutions, but rather about particular individuals in particular institutions and how they attribute and actually give their office meaning. Again, considering the cases of Hammarskjöld and John XXIII, the UN Secretariat at that time, the late 1950s, early 1960s, were relatively young. I mean, not the papacy, but certainly the office of the UN Secretary General. And institutional constraints, nevertheless, were rather limited. For example, why the Security Council in the late 1950s was relatively progressive and at that point of time open. Same was true for the Curia at the Vatican. Moreover, the conditions, for example, the Secretary General encountered in office were unusual and ambiguous. So there was a from the institutional side, there was a relatively openness, and from the world political side, there were relatively unknown and yet very new constraints. Just think, for example, of the joint intervention of Great Britain and France in concerning their crisis or their dispute with Egypt over the Suez Channel, and the subsequent installation of the first peacekeeping mission of the United Nations ever since. So the same is also true for John XXIII. Although the papacy was not young, unstable, or in a state of crisis, the institutional constraints were not that influential. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, subsequently, John XXIII encountered a rather unusual subject and object of international relations, and was nevertheless able to mediate between Khrushchev and Kennedy. And the same was true for the achievements during the Cuban Missile Crisis, when Secretary General Hugh Hunt helped to establish a line of communication together with the papacy between the great powers at that point of time. So to come to an end, although, as I would say, really a piece of liberal peace endorsement, the United Nations Charter struggles between conservative and liberal poles all of the time, and no less so the papacy. So papal interventionism and UN interventionism, kind of ideology of interventionism in political and in secular affairs, is certainly nothing new. For example, protecting fundamental rights of individuals and the rights of people in their quest for authentic self-determination led the popes to harsh criticisms, but at the same time to a rethinking in both institutions on just war theory, which is most evident in the papal criticism on the US military intervention in Iraq, 1990, 1991, and again in 2003. So the temptation to intervene for the sake of humanitarian ends all over the world is certainly on the rise. This is evident in the speeches of the UN Secretary Generals and the popes, at least since the end of the Cold War. Pope Pius XII, for example, could not remain neutral any longer during the Cold War, and neither could the United Nations Secretary Generals. So the question is not only, for example, why John Paul II contributed to the downfall of communism during the Cold War, but rather how and how he managed to do so at all. And furthermore, it is a question of how his action influenced the conceptualization of the papacy. The same is true for, as some would call, secular church United Nations, which acts as an institutional translator, rephrasing religious norms and ideas into a secular language. Just take, for example, the prominent example of Boutros Ghali's reference to the Article 100 concerning the independence of the UN Secretary General, which he called actually Psalm 100 of the United Nations. So we may live in a secular age, but the values and ideas that secularism wanted to ban are influencing how we live in this global age and how we actually see it. And drawing attention to those two positions promises to contribute to rather neglected aspects of the development of world politics after the Second World War. This especially concerns the assumed divide, what I said in the introduction, between the secular and the religious realm of politics. Religious actors, in fact, actively participate in world politics on the grounds of an assumed sacred agenda, and nothing less is true for the United Nations, which reaches out with its very own agenda, with its very own liberal agenda based on the Charter and subsequent texts like the Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 into the sacred realm. I began with a quote from a pope: "You are my lay counterpart," and I will end this talk with a quote from from Hammarskjöld again. Hammarskjöld once said that the United Nations stand outside and necessarily outside all confessions, but it is nevertheless an instrument of faith. As such, it is inspired by what unites and not by what divides the great religions and people of the world. Thank you.
Do I need to press this?
Yes.
Well, that was an interesting and timely talk, and we're going to move to some questions and answers. This topic always reminds me of Stephen Luke's, who talks about the three kinds of power. And for any of you who are parents or in a relationship of some sort, maybe hit it again. He said there's three kinds of power. One is you can be like Stalin, and you can force people to do things. The second one is that you can convince them or persuade them to do what you want them to do. But the third and the much more powerful form of power is demonstrating to people how they want to do this. It's in their interests. So they do what you want them to do because they want to do it. And certainly the kind of moral suasion of these actors that you're talking about today, whether or not they have divisions, certainly is that second and third types of power and influence. So we're going to move right to question and answers. We have a second mic for you in the audience, and what I'd ask you to do is to raise your hand. I'll call on you. And would you identify yourself? Hi, I'm so-and-so, and I'm from so-and-so, and here's my brief question. And that way we can get quite a few people involved in the conversation. Thank you. And we have one right here.
Hi, I'm Amy Vandervliet. I work here at the Berkley Center. I was just wondering if you could speak more to the distinction of what I would perceive as sort of formal moral authority. For instance, the Pope has a sort of a certain authority that people assume that he has theologically. Sort of, if you are a follower of Catholicism, you assume that the Pope has a certain authority. But for someone who is not a follower of Catholicism, who still looks to the Pope as a moral authority, how do you distinguish between those two kinds of things, between something that somebody may assume as a formal leadership role, but is still one of moral authority, versus one that is a more sort of general, cultural, or sort of very high level kind of authority that might appeal to a broader range of people than the direct constituency for which they are responsible for, sort of persuading through moral authority, states or Catholics in this case?
That's a good question. Can we take another one before I answer that?
That's a tough one, actually.
That's a tough one. Good.
Father Jack Curley. I used to be in the Foreign Service, and I'm a priest now. Teach part-time at Catholic in religion and international politics, so I appreciated the presentation very much. I wondered if you had any particular thoughts on the development by Pope Francis of a special advisory group, these 8 cardinals from around the world. I'm thinking, for example, of Cardinal Gracias from Mumbai, giving one whose background was primarily Latin America a broader appreciation, so that then he would have more background in what he would hope for in a global scene, a universal scene.
Thanks for your patience. We've recently rewired this room. We're working out a few kinks.
Okay. I think it's too early to evaluate the influence of this group of cardinals and what kind of influence they have or they had on Pope Francis. But what I think certainly is true is that Pope Francis from the very start took a very different approach towards his office, and that is first of all stemming from a theological or from a point of view from a certain theology, meaning, that is to say, to serve in a parish. And that's, when you look at him, that's where he finds himself most comfortable, being, talking, and doing things. That being said, I can only agree what you said, that coming from the margins of the world, I mean, he himself made this joke when he became Pope, that the cardinals had to look at the end of the world to find a Pope. And the interesting thing is certainly that he is, in a certain sense, from the end of the world, but in another sense, he certainly did not only look to the end of the world to find expertise all around. Those group of cardinals are coming from all over the world, and what I think he's doing is more or less a clever, realistic, in the best sense of the term of Christian realism, and Hans Morgenthau would say what a great statesman would do, meaning to assemble the brightest minds around him and then make a proper judgment. And one of the first things he did, which actually in my view resembles this stewardship as it is attributed, for example, to Roosevelt. That's why I'm using this term stewardship, because I think it fits more than statesmanship or whatever. The very first thing he did in terms of political outreach was to reactivate the diplomatic service of the Vatican, or of the Holy See. And that's one of the reasons why the diplomatic service and the Pope himself contributed so much to this war in the relations between the United States and Cuba, for example. And another topic would be the slowly approaching of the Holy See towards the Palestinians, for example. The first political entity recognized by the United Nations, the Holy See, also recognized the Palestinian Authority. It was quite a major step for a small state, the Vatican City state, to acknowledge this entity, as I would say.
Thank you very much. Very interesting talk. My name is Ken Dante, and I'm not affiliated, but I do interfaith dialogue work. And I was wondering if, I'm almost thinking of Max Weber, the whole thing about charismatic authority versus institutional authority. And the Pope seems to be quite a charismatic figure who has that almost prophetic sense. And I think Weber talks about an exemplary prophet as opposed to lawbringers. Someone who demonstrates by their own life example and their way of being. And I wonder if you would want to talk more about charismatic authority in that context versus the institutional, though he probably holds both.
Thank you. And this gives me the opportunity to at least to try to answer the very first question as well. And that's the whole point of my talk in this bigger research project I'm just setting up. And that's exactly what you said, charismatic authority versus institutional authority. And I think, and that's one reason I would agree with you on the very first question, that you cannot see the Pope and you cannot see, with all those caveats you can make comparing those two. I mean, there's a huge list of caveats and qualifications you can make that you actually cannot compare the Pope and the Secretary General. However, that being said, I would argue, and I'm saying in the project, that the very reason you can compare those two is that they have moral authority or charismatic authority just because certain individuals meet or clash actually with particular institutions. I mean, to put it in other words, very prominent secretary generals such as Hammarskjöld or Kofi Annan would not have been that prominent politicians leading a state. I would argue they would be in no way that important or that widely acknowledged. So that's the reason why I'm arguing it needs certain individuals when they and clashing with certain institutions, and that's one reason I would say that none of those figures, at least since 1945, since we have the United Nations, try to really initiate any kind of revolution, changing their home institution, their host. None of them did, because they were certainly aware that they are, in the best sense of the word, serving a certain institution, that it is worth to be served. Yeah.
Thank you. It was really fascinating. I'm Melody Fox Ahmed. I'm also here at the Berkley Center. On the charisma thing, just one interesting point. We had a live screening of the congressional address yesterday with Paul Eli, one of our scholars here, and he said, he calls him the personal pope, which I was hashtagging, personal pope, organized his address to Congress around people, not policies, around 4 people. So everybody thought that was interesting. I think your comparison of the 2 personalities is fascinating. I guess 2 points. Do you see Pope Francis and Ban Ki-moon, I missed the UN speech this morning, and you probably did too, joining forces somehow to actually create change and take moral action around the crises that are afflicting the world, especially the refugee crisis, the war in Syria, etc. So can they actually affect change besides inspiring people and making everybody very happy? So will there be some more sort of formal coalition or change that comes out of their positions of power, charisma, and unique influence in their institutions? And then secondly, we had a postdoc fellow here at the beginning of the Berkley Center who did an interesting comparison of Pope John Paul II and the Ayatollah Khomeini. So are there other world figures you also would include in this analysis, or you've thought of other religions? And also, you know, thinking on the flip side of this, there's a piece in the New York Times today about the cold nature of President Xi Jinping, who is visiting here today, and how the difficulty the Obama administration has had connecting with him, just because his style has been very chilly, very distant. They can't really get to know him. So he would, it seems like, also quite an interesting comparison with these 2 you're looking at.
Okay, thank you for concerning the first part. Will they combine forces? At that point of time, I don't think so, because of the simple reason that I'm not able to see any, or I didn't found any. I wasn't able to find any evidence for such a combination of forces in the past. But what they certainly will do with continuing their respective tasks over time, as I already said, Pope Francis is very keen on pushing forward his diplomatic service all around the world, with the embassies, the nunciuses all around the world. And in fact, when you look at it, and I mean, I don't want to go into into details concerning soft power, but if you look at the Holy See in simple materialistic terms, you will quickly find out that the Holy See maintains diplomatic relations with some 180 countries all around the world, and that's the second largest provider of embassies, so to speak, after the United States. So the Pope's men, and all of the Pope's diplomats are men, in fact make a change in world politics simply at the most bottom line, simply because they are there. They are there in China, whether they are acknowledged by the official government or not. They are there in Cuba, and so on and so forth. Concerning your second part, concerning the second part of the question, will you include any other figures? Well, I don't think so, because first of all, I've encountered too much troubles already with those two. Yeah? And I mean, one of the first individuals who pops up would be certainly the Dalai Lama, for example. But I have chosen those two simply because of their back structure and of their back bureaucracy, which is so huge and which is quite similar in this respect, and at the same time more or less respected across borders.
I'm going to take the chair's prerogative. Would you tell us about the 3-year research project?
Yeah, I can do that. I mean, the 3 years research project is essentially a project to evaluate how realism, how classical realism relates to religious sources and philosophy, and that's the bottom line. And when you look at classical realists, and I guess most of you are aware of the traditional names, Morgenthau, Carr, Niebuhr, and so on and so forth, you will quickly discover, although this is not widely known, I mean, you know it, but not much of the academia, that the religious roots of the Christian realists are there, and that they heavily influenced their positions. I mean, just to give you one example, I mean, this is kind of anecdotal evidence, but nevertheless it fits with the topic. Morgenthau once, in his first book published in the United States in Scientific Man versus Power Politics, stated in this book in 1946, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments of the Catholic Church, of Christians actually, provide an ethical ground which is aware that political solutions cannot be made on the grounds of simple utilitarian arguments, because you can't argue about those commandments. Just to give you a brief example.
Excellent. We have time for one more question. Anything from the floor? Well, Jodok, this has been a fascinating talk. We're very, very thankful for you coming. You came quite a long way to add Georgetown to your itinerary this time in the United States. So welcome back to the Berkley Center. And there'll be a little bit of time for some informal conversation for the next 10 minutes before we move out of this room. So would you help me in thanking our students?